Hello everyone. This is Omar from the Third Rail. Nice to have you guys. Today we have a special guest. Every week we try to have a guest to try to feed your brains with more intellectual conversation. My guest, excuse me. My guest today is Brian Mora. He is the author of a book called the Able Archer Crisis: The Secret History of the 1983 NATO War Scare. The Able Archer Crisis: The Secret History of the 1983 NATO War Scare by Brian Moore is a book Mora about to explore the tense political and military climate of the early 1980s. Welcome to the podcast, Mr. Moore. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you very much for the invitation. Happy to be here.
I'm glad. Am I pronouncing your name? There's the book you see is on the top corner. You want to get it on Amazon? We put it there so you can see it throughout the show. Um, all right, so I'm glad to have you. I'm glad this happened. And where do we start? I know I was a kid in the 1980s. Could you give me some background on yourself first? I mean, how did you come?
Sh-
Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. Well, let's see, how did I come to be where I was in the early 1980s? Might be a good place to start, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, I grew up in the southern part of Virginia,
Okay.
and I had an interest in, as a kid, as a teenager, I had an interest in international relations and foreign policy and that kind of thing. And when I went to college, I was a history major, but I specialized in Russian history and um, minored in East Asian history, and I studied Russian language. Wanted to be in the foreign service or to be an intelligence officer. And after I graduated from college, I did become an intelligence officer in the Air Force. And I had been in the Air Force for several years by the time of the Able Archer crisis, which played out in 1983. So I was a captain in the Air Force at that point. And so that's how I came to be where I was in 1983 during the nuclear war crisis.
Yeah, I mean, can you give us a bit the atmosphere of the 1980s? You had the Afghanistan war, so the Soviet Union was drowning in
Mhm.
Afghanistan. You had the Contra. There's a lot of things going on during that time. You have the Contra and the leftist government in South America. We had Reagan, who was a little bit nuts, all that stuff. So it was a tough environment at that time, and there was not much communication like today. So what was the operation? Because I read some into it in your book. I highlighted your book. It was about a training by NATO, right? Like an exercise by NATO that triggered this thing.
Well, that didn't really trigger the crisis. That was actually the culminating part of the crisis,
Oh,
and I could certainly get to that. But just to your
yeah,
point, Omar, to talk about the atmosphere of the early
yeah,
1980s, you're right. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan at the very end of 1979.
uh,
Uh, the Soviet Union was deploying new nuclear weapons into Eastern Europe and into Western part of the Soviet Union, which prompted NATO and the United States to respond with new nuclear weapons of ourselves, which were deployed into West Germany and the United Kingdom in late 1983. You mentioned Ronald Reagan. Reagan
yeah,
was president.
yeah,
He was very virulently anti-communist
yeah.
and gave a lot of inflammatory speeches about the
Oh, yeah,
Soviet Union, including
yeah,
two in 1983. And the leader of the Soviet Union by 1983 was a guy named Yuri Andropov, who had been for many, many years had been chairman of the KGB, of the Soviet intelligence service. So that was his background, and
yeah.
he came into the leadership of the Soviet Union with a degree of paranoia that we had never seen before, really, in the history of the Soviet Union. As you said, there were other tensions around the world too,
Yeah. Yeah,
but that was the main, between the U.S. and the Soviet Union,
yeah, but
nuclear tension was
and you
paramount.
had. I'm sorry to interrupt, but you had other, I think, other problems. You had the Soviet leaders were all sick, man. They used to go disappear for a year or two. Nobody knows if they're alive or dead at that time. Yeah,
Yeah.
and the Soviet Union had a leadership issue at that time. Everybody was like, "I send it right now" in the 80s and 90s. You understand, in the United States. So there was a lot of things going on, little small things in there. So you don't know. We didn't even know who was in charge sometime at that time during the early 80s and late 80s.
Yeah, we didn't have a lot of insight into how they made decisions, that's for sure,
Yeah,
and who held sway at one time or another in the Kremlin. And as you said, certainly by the early 1980s, the leadership of the Soviet Union were largely quite elderly and
yeah,
often ill men. One exception to that
yeah,
was Mikhail Gorbachev,
yeah,
who was on the Politburo. He was in the leadership of the
yeah.
Soviet Union under Andropov. Now, he wouldn't actually come into power as the top guy until 1985, but he was the exception that proved the rule, so to speak.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, so we have all this background in there. You have the Soviet Union, which is drowning in Afghanistan. They're probably going broke, and we don't even know it because they could not maintain their economic prowess like the West was, making weapons. Because if you see the Russian weapons, they have a rocket bigger than my house, while we have one is about the side of my door, and it does the same damage as the other one. So and you had the Star, right? What's it called? The Star War, the initiative that Reagan was talking about, from space. So there was a lot of pressure on the Soviet Union. But how did
Yeah.
it get to? I mean, could you give us a background? How did it start? And how dangerous did we get come close to a nuclear war with the Soviet Union? I was a kid
Well,
at that. I was still in junior high school at that time.
yeah, and you're right about, Star Wars was part of this whole
Yeah,
environment, and Reagan gave that Star Wars speech in
yeah,
March of 1983,
right,
and it scared the hell out of the Kremlin because they believed we could actually build it. And
right.
Star Wars a
Yeah,
was
yeah,
was intended to be a missile defense
yeah,
for the United States and our allies. And what the Soviets feared was if the United States could actually build this kind of a system, it would, in essence, negate
yeah,
their nuclear weapons. It would make them, ineffective. And more alarming to them was we could sit behind this shield
right,
potentially and launch our nuclear weapons at them
yeah,
and destroy them. And if they tried to retaliate, we could negate those weapons coming over through a missile defense shield. So that was like the Soviets' worst nightmare.
right,
And that again, that speech revealed the existence of this program
yeah,
in late March of 1983, and it just contributed to the high tension that existed between East and West at that time. But and I can talk about the more
yeah.
specific events of 1983 as we go forward.
Okay, let's start. Give me some background, how it started, and let's go together and move. Let's see.
Yeah. So the probably the first provocative event, apart from Reagan's speeches in 1983, was in April of 1983. U.S. Navy fighter aircraft violated Soviet airspace in the Far East and actually overflew Soviet military facilities. And this really angered the Soviets, and they saw it as either a provocation to really, piss them off, or as a way of prompting a nuclear war. The Soviets had convinced themselves in the leadership in the Kremlin that NATO and the U.S. were planning a nuclear first strike. That's really probably the most important fact underlying this entire 1983 episode. They had reached a conclusion that NATO, one way or another, was going to launch a nuclear first strike on the Soviet Union, and that NATO and the US might be looking for an excuse to do that. And so
Yeah,
this Navy overflight, hey, is this the excuse they're looking for? Um, the event that really triggered the crisis in the fall of 1983, though, was happened on the 1st of September 1983, and that's when the Soviet Air Force shot down a Korean airliner, flight KAL flight 007, and the Soviets killed 269 people on board, including 62 Americans, including a U.S. congressman, by the way, who was on board that flight. So that incident was as I said, the trigger for a kind of a cascading series of events that happened that fall. The American people and everybody around the world, in fact, was aware of this Korean Airlines shoot down. Yeah. What they didn't know at the time was that in the next 2 or 3 days after that shoot down, the United States and the Soviet Union came within seconds of air combat, actually having MiG-23s and F-15s in combat with each other. So that was something that we were aware of in the intelligence community, but it did not get revealed to the U.S. Population or anybody else. So that event, again, eroded relations even more than they already had been damaged. And one of the, many people ask me about how does this series of events compare to the Cuban Missile Crisis, which took place in 1962. And just about everybody reads about the Cuban Missile Crisis in history. And one of the differences between 1983 and 1962 that's important for people to understand is that in 1983, the White House and the Kremlin were not talking to each other. There was virtually no communication between the U.S. government and the Soviet Union, unlike in 1962, when during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev were talking almost every day, both formally and informally. And they kept those lines of communication open in an effort to prevent miscalculation from occurring. None of that was going on in 83. And that lack of communication got even worse after the Korean Airlines shoot down.
What do you think? Was our fault? Was a lot of arrogance from our side, or
there was fault on both sides. And the leader of the Soviet Union, Andropov, was asked by his own general staff, "Why don't you talk to Reagan?" And he just said, "I don't have any interest in talking to him. I'm not going to talk to him." And for our part, I think, especially after the Korean Airlines shoot down, President Reagan and his cabinet were so enraged with the Soviet Union over what they called an intentional murder. That's what they called it. That they just didn't want to talk to them. And so things really had broken down to the point where there was this tremendously dangerous lack of communication. Then the next event that took place that fall was late in September, on the 27th of September. The Soviet National Missile Defense Center outside of Moscow detected, just after midnight on the 27th of September, they detected intercontinental ballistic missile launches coming out of the United States toward the Soviet Union. Now, and the guy that was on duty, the chief watch officer that night, the world was fortunate that guy was an expert in their satellites that were detecting these missile launches. And he came to the conclusion, after an agonizing, debate, he came to the conclusion that these launches must be false alarms. They must not really be happening. Somehow our satellites are picking up spurious signals and so on. And so he made the decision to advise his leadership not to retaliate. And had he not been on duty, had it been somebody else, could have turned out very differently. And yeah, so, and we were unaware of that incident at the time. And in fact, we didn't learn of that incident until after the fall of the Soviet Union
Wow.
in 1998, 15 years later.
Wow.
Uh, so that was, but the Soviets were aware of that incident, and it just heightened their paranoia.
Yeah.
Um, then the final event that fall, and the as I said at the beginning of our conversation, really the culminating event of the
Yeah.
crisis was a NATO nuclear war exercise
Yeah.
called Able Archer 83.
Okay,
And
this is happening. They don't know about the other event. So about the event that happened, with only the Russians know, right?
correct,
Right.
only the
Okay.
Russians knew about that.
Okay.
But that event increased the stress
Yeah.
level and the paranoia of the Russians. And remember, their premise is, we know at some point in the future, the United States and NATO were going to attempt a first strike on us. So we're constantly watching for that. And that event on the 27th of September just heightened their antenna, if you will.
Wow.
Then we get to the Able Archer 83 exercise,
Yeah.
and the timing of this could not have been worse,
Right.
because the Soviets were kind of on a knife's edge.
Yeah.
And what does NATO do? It holds a major nuclear war exercise in early November of 1983. That, again, given the Soviets' mindset, they're inclined to believe, well, this might be the real thing. And they believed that if we were to attack them, it would probably be under the guise of an exercise.
Yeah.
And there were many things about the Able Archer 83 exercise that were hyper realistic,
Yeah.
that to the Soviets observing it, it looked like, boy, this might really be the real thing.
Yeah.
As a consequence of that belief,
Yeah.
the Soviets put all of their nuclear forces, both their theater nuclear forces in Europe and their strategic nuclear forces in the Soviet Union, on the highest state of alert in history, and even a higher state of alert than they'd gone to during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So they were really prepared for a general nuclear war. And in Washington, there was a sense that, well, they can't actually believe that, because we're not going to strike them first. How can they possibly believe that? So there was disagreement within the intelligence community on our side, and within Washington specifically, about just what the Soviets were up to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But do you think? Why do you think there was so much mistrust? I mean, nuclear war is the final act. I mean, nobody's going to survive it. So for this, we're going to hit you first, or we're going to strike first, or they're going to. What was that mentality on between these two countries? I mean, we had two different systems. I mean, we had issues. You understand? But nuclear weapon is like, that's it. That's the last thing. I mean, there's nothing after that. It's total destruction for both countries, or for the world, as a matter of fact. So why was this so mistrust? I mean, are they going to hit us first? Are we going to hit them first? I mean,
yeah, it's a great question. And it was on the minds of everybody in Washington at that time. But I think the answer lies in this. I think it goes to the Soviet sense, probably by around 1980, that they're losing the battle, that they're losing to the West economically, they're losing politically, they can't keep up militarily, they can't keep up technologically. And there was the sense that they're slipping, and they were losing ground. And the war in Afghanistan was part of that. The war in Afghanistan wasn't going all that well. And so it just added to the sense that we're falling behind, and those guys are going to take advantage of us. And the other thing I think to note, those guys being the West, the other thing to note is that, as you said earlier, their leadership was pretty elderly.
Yeah.
And most of the leadership had lived through World War II as adults. And what the Soviets remembered most about World War II was that the Germans attacked them in a surprise attack
Yeah.
on the Eastern Front. Operation Barbarossa is what the Germans
Yeah.
called it.
Yeah.
And they lived in deadly fear of another Operation Barbarossa, only this
Right.
time it was going to be nuclear.
Right.
So it's not even entirely rational,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? But they had this paranoia, this fear. I mean, if you look at Russia today
Yeah.
and what's going on in
Right.
Ukraine,
Yeah.
and much of what Vladimir Putin has said publicly about the
Yeah.
reasons for them taking this military action in Ukraine is it's out of fear. It's out of paranoia that NATO's come right up to our
Water.
very border, right? And why are they doing that? Well, they must be planning to
Yeah.
destabilize us or even attack us or whatever. It's not all that much different than how these Soviet leaders felt in 1983.
I want to ask you a question. I know this is far from the subject. Don't you think we failed Russia as the West by not embracing it after the collapse of 1989? We kind of picked the countries that we wanted and we took them all in, and we just left Russia right out in the cold. And I mean, I would get paranoid too. You just gobbled all the states, the satellite states I had, the Baltic states, all the states that were under the Warsaw umbrella. And we had an opportunity to embrace Russia and bring it right into the fold of Western society economically. I think we missed that opportunity, and this is our fault, and we're paying for this war or probably future war because we failed to embrace Russia after the 1989 collapse.
Well, I think there's some valid points there.
Yeah.
I think that our policy toward Russia in the 1990s was almost one of neglect,
Right.
and it was like they weren't even relevant anymore.
Right.
And why even bother wasting much energy on them?
Yeah.
There were some exceptions to that. I think,
Yeah.
the arms control regimes that we had, there were some exceptions to that. But I think that by and large, this neglect that the United States and our Western European allies had toward Russia in the 1990s
Yeah.
was not smart. And
Yeah. I mean,
and then the expansion of NATO, I think we probably didn't give enough credence to their fears. And as we were expanding NATO, whether it was Yeltsin, who was president in the
yeah.
90s, or even Putin shortly, when he was the new president, they
Right.
expressed concern about this. And I think we, again, discounted their concern as
Yeah.
not being valid somehow, and I think that was a mistake.
Because I read somewhere that Jim Baker made a promise to Gorbachev that we would not move from West Germany above, and then when we did, we said, "Oh, it was in writing." It was, and we did the opposite. We moved right into, I mean, you cannot blame Russia for being paranoid right now because we made a promise that we're not going to move to the eastern part of Europe militarily with NATO and the European Union expand in such a way that it's what, 30 years? That's more than the whole last 100 years. They have expanded to the doorstep of Russia. Russia historically is not an aggressive nation. They never had colonies in Africa or in the Middle East. They were mostly under attack historically, or they were within their own neighborhoods. So if we were able to move to these countries and procure all the nuclear weapons, remember they're all over the place. Yeltsin was drunk as crazy. Why couldn't have we just? I mean, like I know I'm repeating the same thing. Just embrace Russia, bring it in, bring the market to the European Union. You don't have to make it a NATO member or part of the EU. You could say the EU +1, because people, when they do economically good, they don't want war. Everybody wants peace. If you have a mortgage, if you have a car payment, and you're doing okay, you don't have no problems no more. You understand what I'm saying here?
I do. I think that if you look at the history of the 1990s,
Yeah.
which is really maybe the crucial period here,
Yeah.
there wasn't unanimity amongst the Western allies.
Yeah.
So, for example, where the United States, in fact, I think was a bit more willing to
Yeah.
embrace Russia,
Yeah.
but some of our traditional allies were not.
They don't want to.
And there was a lot of the British and the French in particular were very concerned about getting too close to Russia. The other piece of this is that even inside Russia,
Yeah.
there wasn't unanimity either. There
Yeah.
were forces who didn't want Russia to get closer to the
Yeah.
West. So it's like
Yeah.
most
Yeah.
things, it's complicated, but I do think on balance that the West could have made a greater
Better,
effort.
yeah. You know, because you heard of a professor called John Marshall or Marshland. He predicted the war in Ukraine in 2015.
Mm.
I think I saw him online, and I almost went nuts when he said that he's going to wreck Ukraine. He said everything that's happened, and it happened. So,
Well, I don't know him specifically, but I think
yeah,
that, one of the one thing that I think we still fail to perhaps appreciate is just how vitally important Crimea is to Russia.
right,
And 2014
yeah,
was not entirely about Crimea, but it was largely about Crimea.
yeah,
And the fear that the Russians had that, so from a Russian point of view, they
yeah,
feared Ukraine joining EU and maybe even eventually joining NATO.
yeah,
And NATO had said, we're not going to we won't admit you to NATO now, but we're not saying never.
right,
We're
right.
not saying never. And the Russians took that, as a direct challenge to their ability to utilize the military facilities in Crimea, because had Ukraine become part of NATO
Yeah,
at some point, what would be the disposition of Crimea?
but
Because the Russian Black Sea Fleet is headquartered in Crimea. It's been
right,
headquartered there since Catherine the Great.
yeah. But
So,
go
yeah.
ahead.
Yeah.
But
So they weren't going to give that up. But
Crimea was part of the Soviet Union. I think it was redistricted administratively in the 1954. I mean, I read that
correct.
history because I know that
That's
most of
right.
that area was under the Ottoman Empire. Crimea was part of the Turkey. Even the name, and it means Karama in Arabic or in
Right.
Turkish. So it was redistricted or administratively in the 1954. So it's Russian. Crimea is Russian. Why are we gonna lie to each other? And if Ukraine was smart, they could have cut their losses, let go of Crimea, and joined the NATO right away or the European Union instead of having a frozen conflict that would not let them get into the European Union, because the European Union don't want you with a frozen conflict.
Yeah. I have to say, though, I'm not sure Russia would have even countenanced Ukraine joining the EU and NATO had they gotten Crimea. Or I think it's to Russia. I think Ukraine's too important. It's not just about Crimea. It's about the rest of Ukraine too. Yeah.
But they have a brotherly relation. The capital of Russia was Kyiv for a long time ago. For a long time, I think Putin is a dangerous person. I mean, let's not let that go. He's an idiot. He made the same mistake that Saddam Hussein made when he went into Kuwait. They goaded him because they knew he had too much ambition. If what the West realized is, if we let him have Ukraine, we're gonna fight him in the Baltics, because his whole premises was, I'm protecting the Russian minorities. The same thing that Hitler was doing in the 1930s. What are you doing? I'm protecting the German minorities in these countries. So if you go to the Baltics, half the populations are Russians. They're more than Ukraine and all that other stuff. So the NATO said, either we're gonna fight him now with NATO bodies, with the Ukrainian bodies, or we're gonna fight them tomorrow with European and American bodies in the Baltics. So they decided this is the place to bleed Russia, like what they did, a repeat of Afghanistan. You understand? Because they could have did the same thing to them in Syria, but they're afraid of the weapons going to those mujahideen and restart the whole thing all over again with the Muslim fundamentalists. So they are able to give these weapons to Ukraine without worrying about what's going to happen to them in the future. So I think Ukraine was the place where we're going to drown what's his name, Vladimir Putin.
Well, certainly Ukraine is a battlefield that, for many reasons, is more amenable to Western support than say a Syria would be, or
Yeah, yeah,
and the whole conflict in Syria is so complicated. In any
yeah.
event, there's many different, as you know, many different
Factions.
forces at
Yeah,
play
yeah,
there.
yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I think there is a fundamental. I don't know what that
Uh-oh, we
is.
getting nuclear weapons?
No,
We get
boy,
attacked. Don't worry about it, huh?
it's alert. But I
Yeah,
think I think that your point about Russian ethnic Russians is an important one
yeah,
that is often lost upon Western observers. And
yeah.
Putin has talked about it consistently,
Right.
that when he says things like, the dissolution of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy
Catastrophe.
of the 20th
Yeah, yeah,
century,
yeah.
catastrophe. Part of why he says that is because of all of these ethnic Russians that were suddenly not part of Russia anymore, or not part of a
Right.
country controlled by Russia, in the case of the Soviet
Yeah,
Union. And Ukraine is one example, but there, as you say, the Baltics, and there are other
yeah,
states in former Soviet states
yeah,
that fit that description as well.
yeah.
Um, so I think that's I don't- there's some in the West who dismiss that as saying, well, he's just using that as an excuse.
Right.
Putin is just using that as an excuse, but I think he actually believes it.
Yeah.
I think that he really does think that that was a tragic circumstance, and that he would like
But
to
it
redress
was.
it.
I mean,
But
yeah, it was. I mean,
yeah.
if you see such a big country, the Russians are a proud people, and they were humbled and embarrassed. First, they had the drunk president,
Mhm.
Nelson, dancing all over the place. Russia lost its prestige internationally, and in every way you could think, it was embarrassed. And it was, and the whole thing is that we failed to pick it up off the floor and say, "Listen, you did all right. You lost the Cold War. Let's start a fresh start." You understand? But instead, Russia had these people, what do you call them? The oligarchy, the people who have all this wealth, isn't like 10, 20 people who stolen. The public never, they ran out of cigarettes one time. I remember the United States sent them cigarettes and vodka because they were afraid of a crisis going to happen. I don't know, it was like 20 years ago. I was so young. I read about it in the news. We had to send them cigarette and vodka just to keep them calm to avoid a crisis inside Russia. Russia is an important country. I mean, I see it as that. Forget about Putin. You put it on the side. They are a proud people. They are people with a rich history, rich culture. And when you're that proud, sometimes, when you get humbled like that and embarrassed like that, you get up. It's like, you just punch whatever you want to, every way you could see. You just punch everybody in front of you. That's what Yeltsin, I mean, I said Yeltsin. That's what Putin, I think his mindset is that he wants to relive something that's gone. Russia is not going to be like what the Soviet Union again. And for him to wish for that to happen again, I think is dangerous for Russia, and it's going to eventually break down Russia again, and probably break the Russian Federation in the long term. What he's doing right now, you agree with me?
I don't know. Honestly, I'm not trying to
Huh?
dodge it, but I think the jury's still out.
Yeah.
It's certainly, his war in Ukraine is the biggest risk he's
Yeah.
ever taken, and
Yes.
he's really rolled the dice. And
Yes.
it 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 may work out eventually in his favor, or it may not. I think the jury's still out, but it definitely is a huge risk, and it does potentially risk other, additional
Yeah.
internal issues in Russia for sure that could
Not only
be damaging. Yeah.
not only that, we're talking about 1983. He's moving nuclear weapons to Belarusia right now. I mean, this is as bad as going to get. I mean, a simple mistake. I mean, this is the time to worry about a real mistake happening or a misunderstanding. It could create a nuclear holocaust for us and Russia at the same time. So I think we
Well,
need to
and
give him a
and
go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say, Omar, I think that, as I was suggesting earlier, there are really a lot of parallels between 1983 and
Right.
2023,
Yeah.
40 years later, and
Yeah.
not so many between 2023 in 1962, which is what everybody seems to be talking about. You know, they talk about
Yeah,
the
yeah,
Cuban
yeah.
Missile Crisis, but
Yeah,
this
yeah.
isn't really like that. This is more like
Yeah.
83, where there's a lack of communication, a lack of
Right.
understanding, all kinds of potential for miscalculation,
And a lot of
and
weapons
for
going in there.
events,
Yeah.
yes, and for
Yeah.
events getting out of control in Ukraine. Just that what happened a couple of weeks ago with the Soviet fighter hitting the U.S. Air Force
Yeah.
MQ-9 drone. You know, what if that had been a manned aircraft
Right. Right. Right.
and not an unmanned aircraft? It's those kinds of unanticipated black swan events
Can
that
we
could
ca-
really,
yeah,
you know,
create can we give him
create a catastrophe.
a ramp out? I say, okay, take Crimea and get the hell out of here. I know you need it. You need access to the Black Sea, and it's always part of Russia. And we convince our Ukrainian partner, listen, we're not going to support this war forever. At the end, you know, Americans, we have a attention span, you know, like TikTok. I mean, we're going to support you, maybe in the long run, we're not. I mean, we give them a way out, like Iran, but take Crimea, that's it. Ukraine does not become part of NATO military, but could have a special relationship with the European Union economically. It doesn't hurt him. You understand? He probably benefit from that if goods are moved back and forth through that region. Could that be a ramp way out for him?
It's one that it could be, but it's one the Ukrainians won't accept. I mean, it's one that
Yeah,
Zelensky won't accept at this point. And the other problem is that the Russians, they're not going to give up the other territory that they've taken
yeah,
lightly. And they wanted a land bridge to Crimea. They got it now. They
yeah,
really control not only the Crimean ports, but they really control, with the exception of Odessa,
yeah.
all of the other ports. And so
Right,
they
right,
can
right.
they can economically strangle
Angle,
Ukraine
yeah,
if they want to.
yeah.
So that's going to be a tough pill for the Ukrainians to swallow. What kind of a country do they really have left?
Right, right.
And uh, but I do think that eventually there's going to be a negotiated settlement of
They
some
have to.
kind.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And I do think also that the longer this war goes on, the
yeah.
greater the probability of a black swan event, of
Yeah.
a miscalculation, of an
Yeah.
accident,
All
of
right.
something bad happening. Like, you know, again, to compare it with 83, you
Yeah.
had the Korean airline get shot down,
Yeah.
and that triggered this whole series of events that almost led to nuclear war. So one worries about a prolonged conflict just
Yeah.
increasing the chances of bad things happening.
And the power structure in Russia is one guy. Like we have a different structure. You know, the Congress
Mhm.
has to be involved to make war and all that stuff. I mean, we have a real country. I mean, we have
Right.
bodies. I mean that could make
We have
decisions.
institutions
But yeah,
that have
institution. Yeah, Russia. The whole
real power.
institution is Putin. He sleeps and wakes up. That's the whole institution of Russia. So we don't
Mhm.
know what state. He's 70 years old. He had plastic surgery. Imagine if he was worried about his look. I wonder how his brain is. So I don't know. We might push him to the brink. The guy's turning 70 years old. He thought of himself as Peter the Great. I think you can compare him as Peter the Great.
Right.
Now, in his 70, he goes into a war. He's bleeding his country economically and militarily, and men are dying. Even prisoners are now fighting. That's how bad it is.
Yeah.
So, how far can you push this man before he does something unpredictable?
Well, everything I know about him and what I hear from people in the intelligence community is
Yeah,
he's rational.
yeah,
Uh, but that having been said, he's also shown himself to be willing to escalate if necessary.
right.
And so his threats about the use of nuclear weapons,
Yeah,
while they may be unlikely,
yeah,
they're not completely out of the question either.
yeah, yeah. You
That he
can take it
might,
seriously. Yeah,
yeah. And
yeah,
I personally think,
yeah,
I know some people in the intelligence community believe that if the Ukrainians mounted a serious
yeah,
military offensive toward Crimea,
yeah,
then he might if he felt threatened enough, he might resort to nuclear weapons
Yeah,
over
yeah,
over
yeah.
that. But
Tactical.
mhm, yeah, and he knows in Europe he has overwhelming nuclear superiority in Europe.
Yeah,
Russia, we let our nuclear forces really dwindle
right. Right.
in Europe after the end of the Cold War. And so the Russians have about a 20 to 1 advantage of nuclear weapons in the theater. And Putin knows that.
Yeah, but I mean that's all they have. I heard people compare it to a gas station with nuclear weapons. Russia is not a. It's economically weak. Is politically it has no. It's not a country. It's a weak country. Even Obama one time described it. When Obama was describing, I said, "What the hell is he talking about?" You know, because I wasn't
Mhm.
paying attention. He goes, "Russia is a weak country, and it's a dying country. They lose in population. They already lost like 2-3 million since the 1990 in population. So,
That's true. But
yeah.
I also wouldn't underestimate them. I mean, they're technologically very advanced.
Oh,
They are they have some of the best scientists and engineers in the world,
right, yeah.
and economically they're weathering this storm pretty well, actually.
Yes. Our
And
banks are closing. His banks are not good.
and they're getting economic support from
Yeah,
China. China and India are buying their oil and gas.
yeah,
Um, I think some of these predictions of
yeah.
economic
It's not
downfall
gonna happen. No,
are overblown. I think that they're exaggerated, and
because I read he
they're
amassed.
just not to be underestimated.
I read before the war he has been amassing a lot of wealth inside Russia. He had like 600-700 billion dollars. That's what's sitting right
Yeah,
there. So he's preparing for this today or whatever is going to happen. The only
right.
thing is, what scares me more, Brian, is that there's no conversation of a way out. Nobody's talking about that. Nobody's talking about a negotiation. Even just put it, trial balloons in the air, to calm the situation down. It's just like, no, we're gonna send another $6 billion in aid and military aid. We're gonna give them these weapons. We're gonna give them our planes. We're gonna give them. I mean, we you need somebody like bad cop, good cop. We need somebody to come out of Western Europe.
Mhm.
Maybe France, Macron could go there. Listen, guys, enough is enough. Let's find a way out of
Yeah.
this. You understand?
Well,
Because right now you
Macron.
have a yeah,
Yeah, you're right, and Macron actually has been that voice
yeah,
really since early in the war. That why don't we develop a framework for peace and for a
right,
ceasefire, and he's largely been, I think, ignored by
yeah,
certainly by the United States and by other Western leaders. That's what bothers me the most too. What bothers me the
yeah.
most is I don't understand what our strategy is. I don't
We have a
understand
strategy.
what our goals are. What is the
Yeah,
end game here? What does it look like? What's a viable? In every successful war that the United States has fought through history,
yeah,
the president
yeah,
of the United States, whether it was FDR or Woodrow Wilson or Abraham Lincoln,
yeah,
um, had a very clear idea of war termination goals. What
yeah,
does the
yeah,
termination of this war look like? How are we
yeah.
going to resource
Right.
so that we get to those goals?
Yeah.
It was a classic case of strategic goal setting and strategic planning to get there, and I don't see that happening in
No,
this
because
conflict. And it reminds me a lot of Vietnam, frankly, in that respect.
well, I mean, a lot of people get mad at me when I say we haven't won a war. Our record is bad. We haven't won a war since World War II. We broke even in Korea. We lost in Vietnam. We lost in, I don't know how you want to look at it. We lost in Iraq. We lost in Afghanistan. We couldn't beat guys excuse my line, with sandals for 20 years. NATO guys run. Imagine if they had sneakers, what they were going to do to us. Yeah, we were running around for 20 years, wasted money and
Well, I
personal.
would offer one
Yeah,
exception to that, which is the 1991 war, where we
yeah,
did have clear
yeah,
goals.
yeah.
They might not have been, and we stopped short of achieving all of them, but we did have clear goals, and we did achieve most of them. We got
But
Iraq out of Kuwait and so
and we
on.
destroyed
But
the army.
yeah, and we
We destroyed the
destroyed, as
army.
it turned out,
Yeah, we
we
did what we
destroyed their
wanted to.
WMD too. We
Yeah,
destroyed
we
the
did what we.
WMD too
Yeah,
in
we did what we wanted.
1991.
We actually in
Yeah.
'91, the father of Bush, whatever his name we want to call him, he had a strategy. We're gonna go in there,
Yes.
get Kuwait back. We get the chance to kill that army that has been, and they murdered that army in that highway of death they call it, whatever it was called. And we destroyed. We had it under embargo, and we had the country, and that's it. And all of a sudden, he had this fever of Cheney and all this stuff, weapons of mass bullshit destruction. I was a young man there, but I knew it was bullshit. Even with the Washington, why I knew it was bullshit, because they are looking for weapons of mass destruction in his palace. I mean, how many rockets can you hide in the palace? I mean, nuclear weapons, you need the underground, you need these places, you need the big industrial area to store them. I mean, what are they going to do? They're going to put some chemicals in their kitchen? It was such a lie, and we fell for it, and we paid for it. As a matter of fact, we're still losing. If you we lose 6,000 veterans a year to suicide in the United States. We have lost 120,000 since 2001. So we're still at war. We lost. If we lost 120,000 men that came back from Iraq and Afghanistan, that means we're still losing the war. It was a mistake. I mean, it was that. That's why we needed. Sometimes you need an enemy. You know why? Because Russia collapsed. Then we had all these wars. If Russia was still Russia, we would never have these wars, because we have somebody in the opposite side. Thought, no, you can't do that. We're gonna give them weapons. Sometimes it's good to have an enemy to keep you in check, to keep you your mindset good, and keep you energized to fix your country, instead of going into adventures. That's what we've been doing. I mean, we've been losing a lot of wars. I mean.
Well, and again, that 91 war, the difference was we did have a strategy and we had goals, and I don't see that today, apart from, the president saying we're going to do whatever it takes, and then we're actually not doing whatever it takes. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
I'm going to take you a little bit off subject. It's the 20th anniversary of the Iraqi war. I'm from Arabia, and I've been to Iraq before the Iraqi war. Iraq was a secular country. It was mostly a socialist. It was not, the government was not religious. They had no tolerance for all this religious bullshit they have there. They had free education. They had if you buy a house, they give you a down payment. I went to school there as a youngster, free. I'm from Yemen. So what Saddam Hussein used to put, the poor Arabs used to come there, and he'd give them an allowance, $100 a month and all that. And we went to the Baghdad University. When we had the war, I was surprised. This was our ally. We've been saying that Iran is our enemy for the last 50 years. They took our people high. All of a sudden, we're going to go attack the one country that is a counterweight to our so-called enemy, that is Iran, and break that country and hand it over to Iran in a silver plate. That's what we did right now. I couldn't understand that logic, what was going on. I mean, do you have any intake or any outtake on that?
I do. I think another distinction between 91 and 2003 is that we knew all that in 91.
Yeah.
And I was in the government in 91, and we knew all that.
Yeah.
And that's why we didn't destroy Saddam's regime in 91.
Yeah.
Because we wanted him to stay there as a counterweight to Iran.
Yeah.
And 2003, all of that knowledge just seemed to evaporate into the air. I didn't understand it at the time, and I still don't quite understand.
I could understand. I know a lot about the region. I'm like saying, listen, first of all, you propped Iraq into war with Iran in 1981 or 1980 in the 1980s. 500,000 Iraqis died fighting the Iranians as a proxy war with Iran, because we were trying to get even for the hostages and all that stuff. At the same time, we were selling weapons to Iran under the table and selling the Iraq weapons over the table. So we were giving weapons to kill each other. And in the end, you destroyed the whole regime that you propped up and that fought for you in the wars. You destroyed the country. You dismantled the army. Mm-hmm. And you have now Iraq is full of militias. It's not a country. It's like the Mad Max movie. Don't believe when they tell you that. There's no country there. It's not safe. Every region have their own militia. They have the Iranian, the Shia, the Sunnis. You destroyed a whole country that was put together by a crazy man. Saddam Hussein, he had his faults, but there was some economic distribution in that country. Not like Saudi Arabia, who are our ally, who are cutting people's heads off in the street and stoning women for having extramarital affairs. And the wealth is in the hand of the prince of the royal family. You understand what I'm saying? I mean, we destroyed the one bright country that really was a secular country in any way you could think of it. Saddam hated religion. The Ba'athist regime was there's only, I don't know what they were saying, there's no God, and life is whatever is on earth. I don't know how to say it in English. Anyway, that's what I was the 20th embassy. I feel we
Yeah.
did the wrong thing.
Well, again, we didn't have good war termination plans for the 2003 war. What was going to come next?
Yeah.
And I disagree with that. I was pushed by fear.
Yeah.
The 2003 war, I was pushed by fear in Washington.
Okay, but fear of what?
Fear of weapons of mass destruction.
Do you believe that Iraq had weapons? They probably had chemical weapons. It's easy. I can make it home if I mix it. If I get
well, two things there. One, after the war, we did discover chemical weapons.
Yeah, they had. Everybody knows that.
Yeah.
Everybody. That's the poor man's weapons.
Right.
Nuclear weapons.
But that wasn't the big fear. The fear was reconstituting his nuclear program, which was not happening.
It was not.
But was based on terrible intelligence.
It is. I think it was purposeful.
Well, it was
because
terrible.
If you look at Iran is the real scare. They had nuclear plants already in place. I mean, that's the real. Iraq started to do nuclear, and Israel bombed a nuclear reactor in 1981. They had nothing. Trust me. I'm an idiot. What I mean by idiot, I'm a citizen. I'm not like you, an intellectual person or part of the intelligence or have. But I know the difference that Iraq, I could tell it was all BS. And when Colin Powell, may he rest in peace, he's dead. We can't talk bad about the dead. He went in front of the United Nations. He had that. Everybody knows a lie. Everybody, the inspector, that guy was his name, Ritter.
Mm-hmm.
What they did is because he disagreed, they gave him some girl under 15 years old to talk to him and say, "Oh, look, he's a pedophile." Everybody, everybody knew
it was bad intelligence marrying bad policy,
and we lost it. And I'm telling you, we lost money.
And oh my God, the aftermath has been horrible. But it
8,000, 8,000 soldiers.
We didn't have a plan for post hostilities. And so, as you just said, the Iraqi army was disbanded. Other institutions were disbanded. We basically destroyed the infrastructure
right away in one night.
And
we let Iran come in, and Iran just came in. Iran is the real ruler right now of Iraq. If you really look at it, it is the real ruler of Iraq right now. They had
it's a real tragedy.
It is a tragedy.
There's no other way of describing it.
And the other tragedy, I know I want to take you because I want to pick your brain out. The other tragedy is Afghanistan. Mm-hmm. We could have got Al Qaeda. We didn't need to declare war on a Mad Max country. I mean, we had Navy SEALs, we have Beret. We could have went in there, killed the people that we wanted to. Come out, boom, special operations. The Taliban, they were not a threat to the United States. They never they never bombed anything. As a matter of fact, 2 months before, they were in Houston negotiation pipeline that would go through Afghanistan for the oil companies in Houston, and they said no. They refused. That's what probably led to they had to. And the Taliban did us a favor because the whole country was all over the place. They came and they squashed everybody and made one central government that you could deal with at least. You understand, even for bad or for worse. And here we are for 20 years. We could have killed the people we created. And instead of doing the special ops and getting rid of the Al Qaeda and the Arab, the young Arab who are left over, the remnants from the Afghanistan war with Russia, we're actually going to war with 32 countries, NATO, how many, 32 countries and all that, and losing and being embarrassed. And you saw what happened. It's like Vietnam. They had the helicopter, we had the planes, people falling off the wings of the planes in Kabul. It's embarrassing and shameful what happened. And to our armed forces. I like veterans. I'm a veteran guy. I mean, I never went to war, but I usually support them. When I read 17 people kill themselves a day. That's a war right now we have inside the United States.
It's.
So what do you think about that war? Could we have done it better, the Afghanistan war?
Of course. And Afghanistan, we won the war initially against Al Qaeda, and the Taliban. We had to fight them initially just to get at Al Qaeda. But you're right. The Taliban was never our adversary.
Never. They never attacked us. And
it caused us to take our eye off the ball, even of Al Qaeda for a while. But if you look at the war in Afghanistan, we actually fought 2 wars there.
Yeah.
The CIA and special operations were fighting a counterterrorism war
Yeah.
against all the people you just mentioned.
Yeah.
The United States Army, military, and NATO were fighting a counterinsurgency war against the Taliban at the same time. We really only needed to fight the one war,
Yeah.
which was the counterterrorism war. That's the reason we went in there in the first place.
And we could have did it, and we could have won it easily because.
And we should have limited our goals to
Yeah,
that.
instead of taking a whole army in there, nation, you're not going to build Afghanistan. Alexander the Great got defeated there. The British got defeated. Everybody, like they say in the street, everybody and their mother got defeated in Afghanistan. All of a sudden, here we come. We just defeated Russia there 20 years ago. I mean, we should learn from what we did to Russia there. And we're like, oh, nothing happened. You know, and we're singing along. We came in there and we could beat people. One more thing I'm going to ask you.
And if I may just say, in Afghanistan, it again comes back to strategic goals.
There isn't any.
What are you trying to achieve? If you're trying to achieve the defeat of Al Qaeda and its fellow travelers, that's one thing. But if you then expand that to, oh, we're going to fight a counterinsurgency and we're going to create conditions for Afghanistan to become a modern state, on the other hand, that's not going to happen. You know, no. So it's keeping your eye on the ball, and the ball that we should have kept our eye on was the counterterrorism.
Yeah, kill the top Al Qaeda, the ones who are really a threat to our national interest or national security. Anyway, I'm going to ask some more questions here. Please don't. I don't know how much time you have. Why do you think every time we go into a country, we leave, we come out, we went to Afghanistan, we supported, and we left Al Qaeda. We went to Iraq and ISIS, what's it called? ISIS came into power. Mm-hmm. I know I'm going to sound a little crazy here. I think ISIS was a special operation to get all the extremists from all over the Arab world, the Muslim world to one spot and just fucking kill them one time. Like a cheese. You know, we put cheese for the mouse. Because when you look at the ISIS, it's strange. They had all these weapons. When they first took the Mosul, you know what they did? They took a whole brigade. They just left the weapons and the tanks with the keys in them and just withdrew the Iraqi army. I'm like, yo, this is not making any sense here. I think what we did is, if you want to kill the mouse, you got to put some cheese. We made them put this fake state. We got all these extremists from all over the world, from Arabia, from Europe, from the United States, all these young people who want to be a fucking 72 virgins. Forgive me for that word. I hope I don't get in trouble in my neighborhood who's saying this. And we just killed them. I think it was a special op. I know everybody say, "Oh, are you crazy?" I said, "No way. This was a special op. We created an artificial state, this big Khalifa state, whatever it's called. They bring all the extremists to one spot and just get rid of them one time and get it over with."
It's an interesting theory.
Yeah,
but it's predicated on us being a lot smarter than we are.
Yeah. Oh. But I mean, the way you saw the trucks, the brand new Toyotas, how the hell did they get all these thousands of trucks in there? At one time, when they took Mosul, you know, Mosul is in Iraq, a whole battalion, I don't know, was it bigger, brigade or battalion of Iraqi army with the best weapons we gave them, the United States, they just withdrew. There was only 100 ISIS men with fucking little rifles, and they left all the keys and all the stuff in the and all these equipment, these tanks, these cars, these Humvees. It's like it was a gift. We was giving them a gift. I mean, you got, you know, American. You know, I am American, but most my fellow American, they're dumb when it comes to international politics. They only care about the Yankees and the Jets and the Giants. And if cheese get expensive in the supermarket, they don't know what's going on after the border. So when I look at that, I'm saying, this does not make any sense. All of a sudden, even this head cutting and suicide bombers, we never have suicide bombers before 1979. They used to fight. You remember the Palestinians, they used to kidnap an airplane. They never wanted to die. They wanted to get rid of people out of jail. Nobody wanted to. All of a sudden, we got these people, young kids, killing themselves. It's like, I was scared. I was like, this is not in Islam. That's not Islamic. You're going to go to hell if you kill yourself. I mean, but the whole idea is, I know you said that's way too smart. I think it was a special op by the Mossad and the CIA and the Saudis. They said, listen, we built these young Arabs. They fought the Russians. Now they have the know-how. They training people how to fight. How do we get rid of this experience? Let them make their own dumb country. Let them run around because they had a country. They didn't have to fight nobody. They had a land mass more than France. They had hospitals. They had paved streets. The ISIS. They didn't need to bother nobody. Just run the state. They had oil. They had everything that will make up a viable state if they really wanted a state. But now they were running people over with trucks in Europe, chasing people with knives at a fucking bridge. And how many gonna get killed with a knife? I think I'm gonna say that again. I'm gonna sound crazy. It was a special op to get all these extremists who wants to go to heaven early, get them over there. And that's what we did. We killed more than 40. Trump destroyed them. Nobody gives him credit. That idiot, he doesn't know how to take credit. He killed everybody. Mosul was bombed. It's carbon bomb. People, innocent, women, schools. They just bombed it like for 3-4 months. They killed more than 40,000 individuals in Mosul, and they just destroyed it. ISIS is gone. That's all it took. At the end, we killed Baghdadi. Baghdadi could have been a Mossad officer. We don't know that. You understand? All of a sudden,
well,
trust me.
Like I said, it's an interesting theory, but
I don't think about that.
I don't think we're that smart.
We're not.
I don't think we're that smart to have put an op together like that. But it is true. But I think it is true that what ISIS did do is what you just said. It was like a centrifugal force pulling all these people from all
they
over
brought
the
everybody.
world.
Everybody was coming on boats, on planes. Everybody's coming to die there.
It did make it easier for action against them. There's no question.
We got rid of everybody. You don't hear anybody extremists no more. Everybody's dead. I think it was an operation. You put cheese, the mouse will come and eat it. All these young men, they're on. I wanna.
Well, Omar, I am gonna have to. I am gonna have to cut out here in a minute.
Okay. I'm gonna read you a book. I already put it. You see the picture right on top of your head.
Yes.
I enjoyed having a conversation. I love to talk to people who are smart and are willing to. I want to learn from them. You understand? And I appreciate you for coming on, and I thank you very much. Okay.
Yeah, folks can buy it at Amazon or go to my website.
There you go, guys.
www.brianjmora.com too.
Okay, I want to tell you something. I want to that GBTIOS that new they spelled your name wrong. When I looked up your name, they have you as Brian Moore, Moore. When I put Mora, they don't know who you are. But with Moore, they tell us about your book, and they told me everything about your book. You know what I'm talking about? The GBT, the new AI.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you look yourself out. They got you MOR. They don't know who you are. MOR. They don't know you. If you put MOR more, they tell me about your book and what's going on. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, that's interesting. Thanks for that. Thank you very much for the invitation.
And I appreciate you again. I hope I'm going to get you again. Okay.
Okay. Thank you.
God bless. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you. You too. Bye bye.
There you have it, Brian Moore.